Horror games are pretty much the coolest genre out there when it comes to gaming. I mean, they show pretty much just how absolutely amazing the medium can be and how much it immerses you compared to other genres. I mean, think about it. When you look at a horror game or when you play a horror game, you're gonna feel a lot more immersed than you would be in any other type of game. There are many different types of horror games and many different games just in the genre whatsoever, but when you look at it, there's only really two big subgenres in horror games, and none of them have had any real innovation in the last 20 years, and still so many people play the genre and so many people love the genre, including me. Today I wanted to talk a bit more about horror in games, so it's not specifically only horror games I'll be talking about, because I want to talk about how the horror in certain games can also really affect how you play a game, how you immerse yourself in that game. So let's get into it, and let me try and take you on a little joyride on understanding how horror works in games. So I talked about those two subgenres in horror. Most of the times when you have horror games, you have a horror game and you have survival horror. What's the big difference between the two? In a horror game, most of the time you can't really fight back or do anything other than just run away and hide. While in survival horror games, you have a whole arsenal of stuff. It's just very, very limited. Most of the times you have only melee weapons that break or guns with very limited ammo, and you don't always know when you actually have the capabilities to defeat the evil that is in front of you. Survival horror games have been pretty much one of my favorite type of game for the longest time. I love the Resident Evil franchise, I love The Evil Within, and I love every other survival horror game that comes out because they're amazing to play. Now, as I stated, in the last 20 years, not a lot has changed in those games. I mean, yeah, sure, you have something like a Five Nights at Freddy's, which kind of changes the usual stuff, but other than that, not a lot of games are thrown out there that are really that completely different. Most of the times, when you play a horror or a survival horror, it's very simple. A horror game itself presents you with monster or monsters and says go hide or go run and whatnot. That's most of the time what it ends up with. Not a lot of diversity. It's very, very much about the sort of atmosphere that the game can give you by having good environments or having very good music, stuff like that. That really works. But with survival horror, it's more about having this ability to fight back, but not actually being able to know how well you can fight back. This creates, of course, the issue that when you face any new enemies in survival horror, you will, of course, just not know how much that enemy needs, and either you'll waste all your bullets thinking, oh no, I don't have enough for what comes after this, which then, of course, puts this sort of question in your mind. That question, of course, brings sort of the horror with it as you kind of start questioning yourself, which creates fear ultimately, and it's probably one of the best things ever. Quick 15-second PSA, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out as a smaller YouTuber. I wanted to thank you already for clicking on this video, and I really hope you enjoy it. Anyhow, let's get to the video. Now, I've watched a video of that myself. I've seen a lot of videos talk about either horror Easter eggs or the difference between survival horror and horror. But like I said, I want to talk about horror in general in games, because as I said, immersion is really where it's at. I mean, look at, for instance, I think one of the first survival horror games I played, if you can call it that, is BioShock. While BioShock isn't necessarily seen as a survival horror game, take a look at how the game works. You have limited supplies, a way to fight back. The enemies are scary, looking scary. The environment, the atmosphere, everything about the game is amazing. It's just not leaning as much into the survival horror, and a lot of people might not even classify it as survival horror, but it does have elements of that put in there. And because it has so much of those elements in there, the immersion of the game is done so extremely well. There are parts of the game that are made to be scary. There's the botanical gardens. I don't remember exactly what they're called, but there's that level where there's enemies that are able to teleport and get invisible, and all of a sudden they appear behind you and stuff, and it scares you. And I remember playing those things being scared for my life. I think another big part of horror in games is just how accessible it is compared to a lot of different types of genres. When we look at, for instance, the action genre, the fighting game genre, any other genre, it's very hard to find a good game that's free. When you look at horror games, however, there are so many free or very, very cheap horror games that are so easy to access. From Roblox having these sort of horror games to FNAF, and that being like, what, $5 nowadays. So many different things that you can play that offer you this horror thing, and in return only ask for maybe $5 so you can spend a few hours getting scared. As I talked about the immersion and about the atmosphere and whatever, I think that is pretty much the biggest selling point that horror could ever give you. I've watched a lot of horror movies, and I think about 95% of them are absolute trash with just jump scares thrown into them. And while they do have atmosphere, I'm not always as immersed or as scared as I could ever be by a video game. Let's take, for instance, Cry of Fear, a free-to-play horror game, and a recommendation if you never played it, please do. Cry of Fear gave the first boss fight a chainsaw. And not long after that, I remember playing the game, being in a dark, empty house, a fully empty house, not really knowing what to do. I walk around the house, I go through a corridor, and all of a sudden, right behind me, I hear that same chainsaw starting and going off. Now, if you don't know Cry of Fear, the game isn't really easy. Like, you can die very easily. Enemies do a lot of damage. I didn't want to die, so I just screamed and ran and did what I did best and just tried to hide, but that it doesn't work in that game that well. It created this whole fear inside of me that I have never felt with any horror movie. It is an immersion that you cannot recreate outside of gaming, and it doesn't need to innovate. Survival horror games from Dead Space, for instance, 2008 is exactly the same as some survival horror games coming out today. And it's fine, because if you make your survival horror game well, people are gonna love it. Same goes for a normal horror game. Five Nights at Freddy's was the first thing I think I saw in the horror genre that really innovated it, because it did something that no other horror game did, which is you couldn't really hide anymore, right? You couldn't run away from the animatronics. You had to actually strategically play. It was kind of adding strategy to a horror game rather than just putting you in a horror scenario and going, well, you gotta hide and run, and that's pretty much the only two mechanics you've got. Like, you actually have to do things. You have to notice things. You have to do that strategically. There's a whole bunch of things, and while it stays very, very simple and it isn't necessarily giant innovation, it still is one of the biggest horror games out there. I love Amnesia. I think Amnesia is one of the best franchises that we've got in horror, and I think a lot of people think that because, well, Amnesia: The Dark Descent is probably what got most people into horror. Remember being 10 or 11 years old watching PewDiePie play Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and I played it myself, and I gotta be honest with you, the game isn't necessarily really that scary, nor is it really that superb when it comes to mechanics, right? You just have your hand that you can use to open doors and open drawers and whatnot, but the atmosphere of that game is so amazing. I swear to God, it is done extremely well. It has, like, the story isn't even that special. Like, there's not really much to be said about the story and the DLC or any of the mechanics, but just because the atmosphere is so good, it's still being talked about to this day. And that is the case for a lot of very big horror games, because they offer this atmosphere. There's nothing like not knowing what you're about to face for the first time. Same goes for The Evil Within. When you first enter this asylum, all of a sudden you're down in the deep dark horrors of it. There's a guy with a chainsaw chasing you. There's a whole bunch of stuff that just is supposed to scare you and creep you out and not make you understand what's going on. And because that atmosphere is created so well around that idea of you don't know where you're going, you just know that you're in trouble and you need to get out, that alone creates something that no other genre can create. How many Call of Duties, how many Battlefields, how many whatever games have you played and actually thought to yourself, like, I'm really, really immersed right now, compared to when you put on a horror game, you put your headset on, you sit yourself down in front of a screen, you're not even doing VR, you sit yourself down in front of a screen and you're scared to go through a dark corridor, you're scared to go into a dark room because you don't know what might be in there. You might know that the mechanics are very simple. It's either running or hiding, but still you're scared because you're so immersed in what this game is going to give you, what you're going to face, and you don't want it to be bad. You have this fear, and it's an emotion that you very rarely feel. I think the only game outside of horror that I've really felt intense emotion with was Red Dead Redemption 2, and for anyone who's played it, they'll know exactly what I mean. Outside of that, I think horror is a genre that creates this emotion, this fear inside of a human. Horror is being innovated on when it comes to the environments, the type of game you're going to play. There's not a lot of mechanics that are going to change. A lot of games still do the same exact things that Amnesia: The Dark Descent or Dead Space did when they first came out, and that is completely fine, because somehow 20 years later, everyone that's played the genre still wants to play it and still wants to experience new things. Darkwood is a game that is very simple when it comes to mechanics. It is an over-the-top game. It's an indie game. It doesn't cost a lot. Another recommendation. But I have to tell you, the fear I have felt playing that game, not knowing what I was supposed to expect when I first played it, was amazing. It is one of those things that you just cannot describe, you just have to feel. So if there's one thing that I can bring you back at the end of the day with this video that I'm making here, an ode to horror in video games, it's that I want you to play horror games. I want you to enjoy them and really understand just the emotions that you can feel. If you're easily scared, I understand that horror games might not always be for you, and that is completely understandable. I know people in real life who also find that horror games are just not something for them, but you can start off with simple games like survival horror, which is a lot less scary to get into, but which also delivered those scares, like The Evil Within, like Resident Evil, like Silent Hill. There's so many different games that you can get into the genre and really experience that fear while also having a form of being able to defend yourself. That has been my ode to horror in games. It's been a bit of all over the place. I really want to show you how much I enjoy horror games, and I think I've been able to convey that pretty well, but I'd like to know what you think down in the comments below. And while you're down there, subscribe to the channel and like the video if you haven't already. Now, I can understand you're watching YouTube videos about gaming rather than actually playing games, and maybe that's because you feel like you need to withdraw a bit from gaming, or you're a bit into video game addiction. Well, lucky for you, I made a video about video game addiction, and I tried to explain it pretty well in there on how it works and what it does to your mind and body. So check it out, and I'll see you there.